these orca encounters with boats that a lot of media outlets have been reporting on. Have you looked into any of the research out there? Have these orca encounters with boats been on the rise in recent years?
Yes, they have. In fact, there weren't any orca encounters or interactions with boats until 2020. Until 2020, there are two recorded incidences, one in, I think, in the 70s and one in the 80s, and one of them was in the Pacific and the other in the Atlantic. And that's it. That's all there is. So when it started in Portugal and Spain in 2020, and I think the first year, 51 so-called interactions were recorded. It was new, and nobody knew what it was about. And they followed a pattern that was kind of the same all the time. It was the same area. It was even the same individual whales that were engaged in the behavior. And they were more interested in sailing vessels than any other vessels. And they sometimes rammed the boat, but more than anything, they rammed or hit the rudder and chewed on the rudder. And this has only increased since 2020. So today, I think it's estimated that there's been more than 500 of these interactions.
Wow, so it was really unheard of, and then there was this dramatic increase, it appears, based on the research out there.
Yeah.
And then I know you mentioned, and I've looked into some of the studies on this, the one from the Atlanta Orca Working Group, and then another one published in Marine Mammal Science as well.
Yeah.
But I know that those studies specifically talk about the Strait of Gibraltar and Spain and Portugal. Have these encounters happened in other areas throughout the world, or is the uptick really concentrated in that specific area?
No, it's concentrated in that area. It's Spain, Portugal, but also north of Portugal and Spain in the Bay of Biscay, and all the way up actually towards the English Channel. But probably the same individuals, the same population of killer whales or orcas are doing this. Then there was recently, last week, I think, a sailor, a Dutch guy who sailed around the Shetland Isles, north of England, who also reported a so-called attack or interaction. And I don't think anybody really knows what that was about. It could very well have been that it was a whale that came very close to his boat and that he got just really scared. It was obvious from what I read that he thought it was kind of terrifying. And personally, I'm doubtful that it's the same thing, because if you're not used to seeing killer whales and they come up very close to your boat, it is kind of frightening. And they didn't. He said that his boat was hit a few times, but it didn't go for the rudder, and it's kind of lacking all the marks that we see from the population around the Iberian Peninsula, which is that it's usually several individuals and they go on for a while and they go very much for the rudder. So I think unless there will be more in that area, I think this is a stray incident, and we can actually conclude it's only happening around the Iberian Peninsula and north of it, and it's probably only those whales from that population who are doing it.
So it seems like some of the headlines out there about, orcas are doing this more frequently, and they're kind of this blanket statement. It seems like those could be a little bit accidentally misleading, since it really is concentrated in this one area. And it's not like anyone who goes out on their boat there's a risk of this happening anywhere that people are boating.
I would say there's no risk of this happening. unless you're in that area, and probably also unless you were in a sailing vessel. No, I don't think there's any risk of this happening. And I mean, 2 years from now, I may be proven wrong, but then it would have been because the behavior has spread through social learning to other populations. And I don't see there's any sign that this has happened yet.
And I know you mentioned too several times about the sailing vessels. It seems like that's really the trend, is that the types of vessels that orcas are following or ramming or whatever the behavior might be, that it is these sailing vessels. Are there other types of vessels that have been so-called targeted as well?
Yeah, there are a few motor boats that has been targeted as well. And also most of the incidences are happening if the boat is sailing at some speed, but I think there's one incident where it has even happened in a harbor. So there are exceptions from these rules, but certainly the majority are sailing vessels, and even sailing vessels in a specific size. If they become too grand, apparently they're not so interesting, or too small, like the medium sized are the ones that they fool around with.
And I know we've both mentioned several times that a lot of people are referring to these encounters as attacks. What do you think of the use of that word as a marine biologist and a researcher?
Well, I'll say that I've interviewed people who have experienced this, and I understand why they have felt that they were attacked, because it has been quite scary. And if you don't know the animal's intention, maybe you feel that this is an attack. But as long as we don't know why they're doing this, it's kind of premature to call it an attack, because their attack implies that there's some kind of aggression involved in it, whether it's for food or just because they don't like people or boats or whatever it is. And we don't know if there is any aggression involved in this. A guy I spoke to who was on board a vessel that ended up sinking, one of the free boats that has sunk, and he was on board on the second boat that sunk, a French vessel. And he was a biologist, and he was used to observing animals. And it was his impression that he said, they were not aggressive. You can always tell if an animal is aggressive, and that wasn't his impression. But that's one person's observations and his interpretation of it. But as long as we don't know why they're doing it, I don't think it's really in order to call it attacks. It's more neutral just to call it interaction.
And does scientific evidence point to a handful of possible motives behind the orca's behavior?
Yeah. I'll say that there's a fair chance that we'll never find out why. Because to do that, we almost have to be inside their heads. So we may never know. But the three main hypotheses are that this is some kind of revenge, maybe after a very unfortunate incident where an animal has been hit, possibly died from a collision with a boat or an interaction with a boat, and then the other animals have turned their anger towards whatever caused this boats. And the evidence for this is supposed to be that some of the animals that are engaged in this behavior has been observed with some cuts and wounds that could have been caused by a collision or an interaction with a propeller or a boat. But we don't know if they got it after they started interacting with boats. So of course, when they are interacting with so many vessels so often as they are, there's a high risk that they can also be hit by a propeller and be injured. So it's, as long as we don't know the how these events occurred time-wise, it's hard to say what came first. And I don't think anybody knows what came first. I think that the first animals that participated in this were free young animals in 2020. And that maybe corresponds better with a second theory, which is that this is caused by their inquisitive nature, their playful nature, and they're just hanging out in the area, waiting for food to come by, which is tuna, bluefin tuna. And if nothing really is happening, they're just spending their time toiling with the rudders of sailing boats instead. And then they may find that this is giving them a thrill, that this is fun, and certainly, and that is something that is known. The behavior has spread in the population, whereas it was originally just 3. It is now at least 15 individuals in the population that has been identified doing this. And the third theory is that it's some kind of response to living in a stressful environment, which is full of noise and pollutants and ship traffic, and this is just a very stressed population, and they're reacting to the combination of all these stress factors, and that's why they're doing it. And I can't rule that one out. Certainly all these stress factors are present in the area. I don't see why they should start doing this behavior because they have heavy loads of pollutants in their body, or because there's a lot of noise. It doesn't really, that one doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But I mean, I'm with all the rest of the people who are looking at this. I don't know.
I think those are all the specific questions that I have. Do you think there's anything worth adding that I didn't touch on, or anything you'd like to add?
There's one thing I'd like to add, and that is that there's a lot of concern about the safety of sailors. And that's, I think, is quite right. I mean, it's very obvious that the sailors are at risk. Free boat has sunk, and luckily nobody has been hurt by the boat sinking. But I think there's very little talk about the risk to the animals, because this is actually a highly endangered population of killer whales, which are only found in these waters. And the population is less than 40. At the last count, I think there was 35 individuals. So it's a very small population, and they are really threatened. And I think that this behavior is putting them even more at risk, because in order for conservation to work, you need people's support. You need people to care about the animals. You need people to care about the environment. And I think that if you are, I'm thinking a lot about the conservation implications of this, and how conservation measures need to step up, and that it's important that we talk about these whales as endangered, even though they're doing something that a lot of people don't like. It's really important to talk about just how threatened this population is.